Thank you very much for the kind introduction. I hope you can hear me clearly and you can see my presentation.
Everything is well.
Okay, I begin. The task is to become oneself by appropriating Nietzsche, an infinite and almost impracticable task. Becoming oneself is what is at stake in Jaspers' critical confrontation with Nietzsche. More still, becoming oneself is the very core of Jaspers' existential philosophy. Existenzphilosophie is the way of thought by which man seeks to become himself. This way of thought does not cognize objects, but elucidates and makes actual the being of the thinker. I will not directly investigate the relationship between Nietzsche and Jaspers. Instead, my talk will focus on an almost unknown manuscript by a third philosopher, Georges Canguilhem. In this unpublished text on Nietzsche, the central issue is becoming oneself. Not only Jaspers plays an important role, but also the book from which I have just quoted, Michel Dufresne's and Paul Ricoeur's Karl Jaspers and the Philosophy of Existence. What does Canguilhem have to do with existentialism? As long as Alain's student was seen just as the austere science historian, the connection had to remain mysterious. However, we have known very well for some decades now that this philosophical engagement went far beyond the history and theory of science. Only against the background of this broader spectrum of interest does it become understandable why Nietzsche was imported for Canguilhem. I addressed this relevance at one of our international conferences in Naumburg 10 years ago. Canguilhem's unpublished manuscript I will talk about today is from 1947-1948. The author is then about 43 years old. A few years before, in 1943, he had published what is still his most famous book, the Essay on Some Problems Concerning the Normal and the Pathological. And a few years later, in 1952, the well-known collection of essays entitled The Knowledge of Life will appear. I could consult, decipher, and transcribe Canguilhem's unpublished manuscript in the Fonds Canguilhem. Unfortunately, Canguilhem's last will prohibits publishing text from his legacy. Hence, the manuscript cannot be printed. I will quote from it only very sparingly. The title consists of the name Nietzsche, to which the maxim "become who you are" is premised, first in French and then in the original German. This title, which immediately recalls the well-known subtitle of Ecce Homo, How to Become What You Are, is taken from the honey sacrifice, the first speech of the fourth part of Thus Spoke Zarathustra. After designating himself as the most spiteful of all fishers of human fish, Zarathustra continues, "That's what I am, after all, at bottom and from the start, reeling in, raising up, raising, a raiser, a cultivator and taskmaster who not for nothing once told himself, become who you are." Zarathustra's version of the formula is the one that sticks more closely to the saying from Pindar Second Pythian Ode that accompanied Nietzsche since his youth. On November 3, 1867, he quotes Pindar's maxim in the original Greek when he reminds his friend Erwin Rode of our memorial on the banks of that Leipzig river, which we baptized Nirvana, and which in my turn bears the festive words that have proved victorious, genoi hoios essi. In his letter, however, Nietzsche omits the last word of the saying. He will do so as well in his German versions of the verse. The whole line reads, genoi hoios essi maton. Here an English translation of the whole saying, become such as you are, having learned what that is. With the following words translation that is not at all poetic and a bit redundant, I will try to make the sense more explicit. Become such as you are now that you have learned what sort of man you are. One crucial issue is how Pindar's word hoios should be translated. Hölderlin keeps quite close to the original and renders the word with welcher, which, such as werde welcher du bist erfahren. Nietzsche does not translate hoios with such as, but sometimes, as in Zarathustra, with who, there, and in Ecce Homo with what. So a key difference between Zarathustra and Ecce Homo lies in the way Pindar's hoios is rendered. Nietzsche's omission of the last word does not just make the verse more citable. It is also apt to decisively change its meaning. With Pindar, the Pythian Ode itself is supposed to teach the young aristocrat what sort of man he is. In this traditional society, the poet tells the noble who his ancestors are, praises their deeds, and encourages him to live up to them. After the young aristocrat has learned about his nobility, he may become worthy of his status. Let's totally disregard this concrete social context. With Pindar, you must first learn what sort of human you are. Only after that you can become such as you are. If we neglect the abyss that separates the archaic poet from Jaspers' existential engagement, the quoted passage from his philosophical autobiography shows a similar structure. Existenzphilosophie is the way of thought by which man seeks to become himself. This way of thought does not cognize objects, but elucidates and makes actual the being of the thinker. According to Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, one should not seek to become oneself. The book tells us how Nietzsche has become himself, not how he tried to become himself. There was no trying. Still less should one try to become oneself by elucidating oneself. Conscious trying to find oneself would have been self-defeating. Becoming what you are presupposes that you have not the slightest inkling what you are. If you should unfortunately learn what you are too soon, you would never be able to become yourself. The Socratic maxim, know thyself, noscete ipsum, would be the recipe for decline. One could say that Ecce Homo in the end reverses Pindar. With Pindar, you become such as you are only after you have learned what sort of human you are. In Nietzsche's Ecce Homo, it is just the opposite. You learn what you are only after you have become what you are. Canguilhem knows very well Nietzsche's deep perplexities about self-knowledge. At the beginning of the investigation, the French philosopher emphasizes the opposition between the Socratic precept, know thyself, and the Nietzschean maxim, become who you are. Later on, in a crucial section of his lecture, Canguilhem takes up Jaspers' commentary on Nietzsche's maxim. Jaspers makes a principal distinction between the aim of empirical knowledge and the task of philosophy. Empirical knowledge aims at objective truth, whereas philosophy looks for illuminating truth, erhellende Wahrheit. Philosophy as an existential appeal reads ciphers of transcendence and aims at the Existenzerhellung, the clarification of existence. Given this great divide between empirical claims and existential appeal, Jaspers cannot but object that Nietzsche constantly confuses and hybridizes the two levels. Nietzsche's approach to the formula, become who you are, is a particular case of this more general inconsistency. The maxim, become who you are, is actually an existential appeal, even if Nietzsche keeps mistaking it with a statement involving naturalistic claims about biological and or psychological facts. Between life and existence, the title of our conference couldn't stand for this inconsistency Jaspers finds in Nietzsche. Canguilhem subscribes to Jaspers' anti-naturalism only up to a certain point. Nevertheless, he largely shares Jaspers' objection. He agrees with Jaspers that Nietzsche himself quite often tends to interpret his maxim in a naturalistic sense, and that this naturalistic reading remains objectively inadequate. So, Canguilhem contrasts possible naturalistic interpretation with a range of philosophical readings of the maxim. He maintains that the basic idea of the philosophical approach is that at the origin of this being that we are enjoined to rediscover, there is not a given fact, germ, aptitude, gift, disposition, but a choice. In the end, however, after having dealt with Jaspers, Canguilhem comes to a different conclusion. We said choice or gift, you see, choice or gift. We said choice or gift. With Jaspers, we have choice and gift. How this? At first, Canguilhem claims that philosophers do not focus on empirical categories like, say, gift, understood psychologically in the sense of giftedness. Here, he sees a clear alternative between the naturalistic concept of gift and the existential category of choice. In Jaspers' philosophy, however, gift is not a naturalistic category, rather, it is just like choice, an existential category. Hence, Canguilhem ends up emphasizing that Jaspers' philosophy insists on both existential categories, not only on choice, but also on gift. Here, Canguilhem's interpretation is not exclusively the fruit of his own direct reading of Jaspers, but is indebted to a then very recent French monograph dedicated to Karl Jaspers and the philosophy of existence, 1947. The authors, then in their mid-30s, are Michael Dufresne and Paul Ricoeur. Incidentally, Dufresne and Ricoeur claim that become who you are is first and foremost a Kierkegaardian theme, even if they obviously know and acknowledge that Jaspers also remarks the presence of the maxim in Nietzsche. So they surmise that the main inspiration in Jaspers' development of the issue become who you are is Kierkegaard and not Nietzsche. Are Dufresne and Ricoeur right? An analysis of Jaspers' views on choice and gift shows that the two French philosophers are not wide off the mark. According to Jaspers, the ultimate choice is choice of self. First and foremost, to choose is to choose who one wants to be. I come to me by choice is at the origin of this being that we are enjoined to rediscover. However, things are not that simple. Humans do not decide to be born. They do not decide how, where, and when. We do not choose our body. This is what Heidegger calls Geworfenheit. With Heidegger, we have been thrown into the world without being asked. Jaspers is more harmonistic. We have been given as a gift to ourselves by transcendence. I am given as a gift to myself what is most my another, which is my transcendence. The freedom to which I may become myself is a gift from transcendence. I come to me as a gift. Transcendence are the reason why Dufresne and Ricoeur, seeing Jaspers become who you are, first and foremost a Kierkegaardian theme. Nietzsche does not leave place for the concept of transcendence. Since transcendence sets limits to finite freedom, Jaspers interprets the absence of transcendence in Nietzsche's philosophy as a lack of limits. Nietzsche's concept of creation stands for freedom without transcendence. To create is to be free without the limit of transcendence. In the fact that Nietzsche interprets the creative origin without transcendence, Jaspers sees the reason why Nietzsche keeps misunderstanding the imperative become who you are. Jaspers' theological and metaphysical inclinations remain alien to Canguilhem. However, even if their views are ultimately widely divergent, the French philosopher's lesson shows a certain consonance, perhaps somewhat unexpected, between Canguilhem's vitalist standpoint and Jaspers' existentialist stance. We have seen that Canguilhem, Nietzsche often tends to interpret his maxim in an inadequate, naturalistic sense. In Canguilhem's lecture, however, Jaspers does not have the last word. Finally, Canguilhem sketches out his own interpretation. A basic concept of Canguilhem is to emphasize the distance between Nietzsche's become who you are and metaphysical views like Schopenhauer's Kantian theory of the intelligible character as a timeless being that is somehow realized in becoming. According to such metaphysical views behind becoming, which is only apparent and therefore not really historical, there is a ground that remains impassive and immutable. These theories still involve the ancient Greek primacy of being over becoming. One could say they also involve the primacy of essence over existence, but Canguilhem does not formulate his criticism in these terms. Now, Canguilhem points out that given Nietzsche's anti-Platonism, such a primacy of being over becoming is out of the question. Taken literally, however, the maxim "become who you are" seems to suggest that who you become is strictly determined by who you are. Hence, that becoming is determined by being. Canguilhem is looking for an interpretation of the maxim that does justice to Nietzsche's anti-Platonism. To Nietzsche's anti-Platonism belongs the thesis that there is no being behind becoming. This anti-Platonic tenet involves the further thesis that there is no subject behind the actions. In the maxim "become who you are," the expression "who you are" must not suggest anything like a self-identical subject. There is no logical identity of the person. Logic, the principles of identity, non-contradiction, excluded middle, does not apply to the ontology of persons. By the way, Dufresne and Ricoeur make the same point about Jaspers. Canguilhem reaches the paradoxical conclusion that there is no who, there is no celui, or at least in the end, the who is irrelevant, to become is to do. Nietzsche's "become who you are" does not involve the identity of the person. The self is not an identical substance, not an ontological category. What about the necessity that seems implied in the "become who you are"? Necessity is really involved, but according to Canguilhem, not ontological necessity. Quite close to Jaspers, he writes, "This necessity is of course not a category of thought, nor a law of the world. It is not a divinized causality, determinism, in which Nietzsche does not believe any more than in identity." So Canguilhem. The self and its necessity are the object of an affirmation. That one says yes to life and affirms oneself does not imply that there is a self. The same is true of necessity. At the top right of the first page, Canguilhem penciled in amor fati with a question mark. This question mark is probably to be understood as a doubt whether amor fati would not be a more appropriate title than "Become Who You Are." The reason for this might be that in the end, all that remains of the maxim "become who you are" is just self-affirmation, amor fati. Here, Canguilhem is inspired by the last two paragraphs of "Why I Am So Clever." From the answer to the question how to become what you are, Nietzsche moves to the realization of being marked by amor fati. Nietzsche's main aim in "Why I Am So Clever" is to tell the reader what his task is, the revaluation of values, namely, and that after having accomplished it, he now can say that he is the revaluator of all values. In this sense, he is now able to answer the question who he is, but this does not mean that he knows himself in the mythical introspective sense, in which, according to him, no one ever knows oneself. Canguilhem deals with Nietzsche's text very, very freely. As Canguilhem sees it, the imperative to become oneself is the same as the imperative to say yes to one's whole being, amor fati. Unconditional self-affirmation is the lasting and valid core of become who you are. In a sense, Canguilhem concludes, the maxim should rather be become who you are not. The wording of the maxim become who you are seduces us to conceive of the ideal we want to achieve as our own first nature. We should not succumb to this temptation to project value into being. We should not ontologize value. In this sense, any metaphysical or objective content of the maxim ends up dissolving. Speaking of who you are or of what you are only apparently has ontological implications. The maxim has no theoretical meaning that could be explained naturalistically or metaphysically, but only an existential scope. Against this background, Canguilhem gives a minimalistic interpretation of Jaspers' achievement. With Jaspers, to become what you are seems to have to find not a rational explanation, but the explanation of its non-rational meaning. What is meant? The maxim has no rational explanation and no theoretical foundation, and Jaspers' philosophy merely clarifies the non-rational meaning of the maxim, its existential scope. I'm coming to the end. I would like to say just 2 more sentences on the place of the conference in Canguilhem's work. A few years earlier, in 1933, he had published his essay on the normal and the pathological. This book dealt with another example of the same confusion. The positivists are right to reject the old metaphysical conception of the normal and the pathological, but misunderstand the normal and the pathological when they turn them into objective categories, whereas in fact, the normal and the pathological are norms related to vital and even social values. The normal and the pathological are not of a factual order, but have a normative character. At the end of the day, Canguilhem's lecture on Become Who You Are warns that Nietzsche's maxim can be subject to the same confusion. Become who you are is a norm whose presumed metaphysical or objective content cannot but dissolve on further analysis. Thank you very much.